like to welcome you to a presentation that many of us have been looking forward to for several months. Professor Stephen Castles, who will speak on Neoliberalism's Global Workforce, The End of a Dream. Stephen Castles' book, I think, has been read by The Age of Migration, I think has been read by hundreds of students on this campus. It's a popular text in international studies. I use it in teaching human rights, alien, and citizen. And I think one of the unique factors that many of us who use Professor Castles' book to teach with find is that he really truly has a global view of global forces. Having worked in Asia, in Australia, in the UK, and doing a lot of cooperative work with social scientists in the Americas, he's able to bring to his discussion of worldwide migration issues not just the comparative attitude of someone who knows one region well and finds a few similarities elsewhere, but someone who really thinks at a global level. He's a research professor of sociology at the University of Sydney and associate director of the International Migration Institute, University of Oxford. Until August 2009, he was professor of migration and refugee studies at the University of Oxford and was director of the IMI. He's a sociologist and political economist and works on international migration dynamics, global governance, migration and development, and regional migration trends in Africa, Asia, and Europe. From 2001 to 2006, he was director of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford. He's been an advisor to the Australian and British governments and has worked for the ILO, the IOM, the European Union, and other international bodies. His recent books include The Age of Migration, International Population Movements in the Modern World. The fourth edition is 2009, and it has a pretty nifty website that goes with the book. Migration and Citizenship in the European Welfare State, A European Dilemma. And that was co-authored by Karl Ulrich Scherup and Peo Hansen at Oxford University Press 2006. And Migration and Development Perspectives from the South, edited with Raul Delgado Weiss, published by the International Organization for Migration. Another, to me, important feature of Professor Castles' career is his commitment to working with and working in dialogue with migrant organizations. In other words, in his research, migrants are not just objects of study, but are in fact subjects whose experience is important to the overall analysis. He's participated in meetings of the World Social Forum, and we managed to get him to come to the University of Chicago because he is on his way to the meetings in Mexico City of the worldwide NGO network called the People's Global Action for Migration and Development, an organization of civil society organizations who meet annually at the intergovernmental or around the Intergovernmental Global Forum on Migration and Development. I want to welcome all of you. Before Professor Castles starts, there are three things to mention. First of all, I would like to thank Sarah Rober, the truly competent and intrepid office coordinator of the Human Rights Program, who does all of that logistical work that makes visits like this and talks like this appear smooth. It's the work that's usually invisible and doesn't get acknowledged. So I want to thank Sarah for all of her hard work. I would like to invite all of you to reception downstairs in the common room on the first floor. That's right, Sarah. After this lecture, the food is from Piccolo Mondo. The program on international studies helped contribute money. If any of you have friends who are wandering around the campus hungry, text them and invite them to come because I think we have a ton of food. I know there are at least 2 cases of wine involved, so it should be a nice party. And last but not least, I want to welcome Professor Castles' wife, Professor Ellie Vasta, who is somewhere in the room, who gave a talk today at noon at SSA. She also does research on migration and the integration of immigrants. Oh, I know what I wanted to do. I want to do a very fast survey, just so Professor Castles knows who's in the audience. How many people here are students at the University of Chicago? All right, how many people here are faculty and staff at the University of Chicago? And how many people here are visitors from the world beyond the University of Chicago? All right, welcome to all of you, and welcome to Stephen Castles.
Well, what a wonderful introduction. I should really go home now, I think. But I have to say it's an enormous pleasure to be here and to thank Susan very much and Sarah for looking after us so well. And also to say what a pleasure it is to have the angels looking at me as I speak. But they're looking at you too, so be careful. As Sarah said, as Susan said, we're going down to the People's Global Action on Migration, Development and Human Rights in Mexico City tomorrow. And I should just say why that's, well, I think it's important. There's a global forum on migration and development, which is an intergovernmental body and meets every year and has met every year since 2007. And it has no decision-making powers whatsoever. And I've always seen it as something that is a bit of a whitewash. It's really there to make people think that things are happening. And what's new this year is that in Mexico, this People's Global Action will be meeting for 3 days beforehand and will be really making, we hope, making some important progress on this issue. And what they're trying to do is bring the human rights issue into the migration and development debate. And I think that's a terrifically important thing to do and really changes the game quite a lot. So I'm very pleased to be part of that. But anyway, let me come to what I'm really talking about. This idea of the neoliberal dream is really the idea that, you know, the period of neoliberalism that started in the 1970s and came to a juddering halt in 2007-8 with the financial crisis and the housing crisis and now the crisis of state finance in many countries. It's a time now to reevaluate if the neoliberal model has delivered what it promised and whether it's sustainable, whether it is likely to be resurrected and continue, or whether it's played out and we should be looking beyond it to some new approach. But of course, that's a huge topic, and I wouldn't dare to talk about it all. But what I want to talk about is just this one aspect, the global labour market, which is part of that neoliberal model. And it's, it's a model of an international mobilization of labour, both through migration and through outsourcing, of course. And the idea is that it will lead to a much greater efficiency of production, productivity, and so on throughout the world. So in principle, it should lead to, I think I've got it on here, the idea of reducing inequality at a global level. Now, the first reason one should be slightly skeptical of that is that, in fact, if you look at a lot of the indicators, I usually follow a World Bank economist called, Milanovic. He argues that global inequality is greater than it's ever been before. The model is based on the idea of the free flow of commodities, capital, technology, and labour. And in other words, the idea of open borders for all these flows of resources. And of course, there are problems about open borders. We know it from international trade that, in theory, international trade is meant to be completely free. The reality is, of course, that rich nations continue to protect at least certain sectors. The European Union, for instance, has a European agricultural policy which heavily subsidizes production in Europe and then dumps surplus products at very low cost in the third world, and in doing so destroys local agricultural sectors. For instance, chickens from Europe, frozen chickens, have almost wiped out chicken farming in parts of West Africa. You'll know this from the United States because the cotton subsidies to a very small number of US farmers, but very efficient, highly mechanized farmers who produce cotton, I think there are about 50,000 such farmers, allow the United States to export large volumes of cotton, which have had devastating effects on the Indian cotton industry. I mean, these are just examples, there are others. But the point is that the idea of open borders is only meant to apply to certain things. It's never been complete. But the hypocrisy is much the greatest with regard to flows of people, because although neoclassical economists and many business people are very much in favour of open borders for labour, politicians are very sceptical about it because they see that people, electors, voters, feel very threatened by the idea of lower paid workers who might come in and take their jobs. There's a lot of hostility to free migration. So politicians on the whole have policies of strict control. And you could see it as a vestige of sovereignty in a world in which governments have less and less control of what actually comes across their borders. They can't stop capital flows and trade flows, but they can stop flows of people. At least they think they can. So there's a contradiction between this neoliberal economic principle of free movement of labour and the reality that politicians see a strong need for control. And I know this is a big issue in the United States, of course. That contradiction is only seemingly dysfunctional for capital, because the reality is that by forcing millions of people to migrate in an irregular, or some would say illegal way, what it actually does is create a working class, or a segment of the working class, which has no rights and is very easy to exploit, because these workers can't go to the law courts, they can't join trade unions, and it's very hard for them to resist pressure on their wages. So it's not as irrational as it sounds. So to understand this issue of how the global labour market has developed historically and what it means now, one needs to look at three different processes. The first one, this is what I'm going to go through, the restructuring of labour markets since the 1960s, then what's happened to the welfare state, and then what's happened to citizenship. And of course, they're not really separate stories, even though I'll deal with them that way. They're part of an overarching theme, what I call the Neoliberal Counter-Revolution. And then, of course, there's a fourth theme that I hope we'll get to, and that is the global economic crisis, and does it mean the end of neoliberalism? So I'll probably spend most time on the issue of the restructuring of labour markets. So it falls, I believe, into three phases. If you go back to 1945, there was a phase in which manufacturing industries were expanded in core economies, by which I mean North America and Northwestern Europe, through using the existing production techniques. You could call it Fordist industry, mass production, big factories. And that means concentration of workers in these big factories, and that allows the formation of strong trade unions. It allows secure employment and gradually improving wages. And of course, the strength of the labour movement at the same time allows the strengthening of welfare states, which protect workers and their families. And in this phase, you get migrant workers being recruited by all the countries concerned, because they begin to have labour shortages by the late 1950s or 60s. But they are legal foreign workers. They're either workers who come through recruitment systems like the Bracero program in the United States, or like the guest worker system in Germany, or the workers who have free movement because they come from from former colonies, as in the case of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and so on. So that they're legal workers, they're certainly at low levels within the productive apparatus, but they still have reasonably secure and stable jobs. They have resident status, sometimes restricted, but they're not irregular, and they have reasonable wages and usually full entitlements to welfare systems. The second phase, that shouldn't have all come at once, but it has. The second phase starts with what was called the oil crisis in Europe. I don't know if it was called that here. Yeah. 1973, the OPEC countries raised the price of oil dramatically, restricted output, and the whole of the developed world went into a recession for a couple of years. And that led to major shifts in global investment strategies and also into the way migrant workers were deployed. So instead of bringing the workers into the core industrial areas, capital was exported to new low-wage production areas in less developed countries. And that applied particularly, of course, to the labour-intensive forms of production. In other cases, the actual oil states, of course, were able to accumulate a great deal of capital and to develop their own industrial and commercial bases. So the oil companies, particularly of the Persian Gulf, became major importers of labour. So you have this dual process. On the one hand, the decline of the old so-called Rust Belt or Fordist factories in the north, and the emergence of new production areas in the south. And this was combined in the north with a sort of rollback of the rights of trade unions or the power of trade unions and a rollback of the welfare state. In the south, the strategy of the developed world was the imposition of structural adjustment policies which reduced the strength of the state in the south and eroded government institutions in the fields of education, health, and welfare, and so on. So again, we have, if you look at the situation of migrant workers in developed countries, in Europe at least, the idea was that the guest workers should go away. They were seen as temporary workers who had no right to stay permanently. But they didn't go away, especially those from poorer countries like Turkey and North Africa decided things were even worse at home and they would stay on. Workers from better off countries, particularly the countries which were joining the European Union, Italy as an original member, but then Spain, Portugal, and Greece, were more likely to go home, but Turkish workers and North Africans stayed on, and they brought in their families. And states like Germany and France tried to prevent that. They had policies to encourage people to go home, workers to go home, by paying them, and they had policies to force people not to bring their families in. They tried to make family reunion illegal. And this is a very important point, because what happened was then that the law courts said, well, actually, our constitutions protect the family. People actually have a right to live with their family, even if they're foreigners. So the law courts in France and Germany actually prevented these policies that were designed to stop family reunion. So what happened was that the guest workers who didn't go home became settlers, and new ethnic minorities emerged in European countries. The story in the United States is slightly different, of course, because in the United States, the legal migration from the south, from Mexico, was stopped. But then in 1965, the new immigration law in the United States actually allowed migration from all over the world. It was probably not a deliberate policy, but it did open the door to migration in a somewhat unexpected way. The third phase really comes in the 1990s, because after 73, certainly the European countries said, we don't want migration anymore, we have zero immigration policies, there should be no more immigration. With the end of the Cold War and the coming down of the Berlin Wall and all the other walls that divided Europe, there was a huge increase in migration, but it was also an increase not just from the east, but also from the south. So suddenly, migrants began flowing into Europe again in quite large numbers, not as guest workers, but as asylum seekers, irregular workers, workers who found opportunities for work even though they weren't particularly welcomed by governments. And what then happened was that by the beginning of the 21st century, the governments of the European Union were beginning to realize they actually do need migrant workers because of the demographic changes in Europe, because the European population is aging, it has very low fertility rates, there are fewer and fewer children being born, which means much greater age dependency rates, and suddenly they realize there is a need not only for highly skilled workers, which of course are a benefit because they save education costs, but also for workers for care, catering, the building industry, all these industries where the products have to be produced, where they're consumed. So what happened in Europe was, because governments were unwilling or unable to set up legal migration systems for the lower skilled, you get very high levels of irregular migration developing, a bit like in the United States. They're not quite as high as in the United States. Somehow politicians seem either not to have realized that this was happening, or they were in denial. And we saw this most clearly about 5 years ago in Britain, when we discovered that the Immigration and Nationality Division of the Home Office was employing irregular workers, irregular migrants, as cleaners. And, you know, this was revealed by the British press. The only people who were surprised, apparently, were the politicians, because anyone who knows about migration knows that that's how the cleaning industry works, through the subcontracting system. 6 months later, the Home Office discovered that some of their security men were also illegal migrants. But, well, that's another story. So what happened in this period? Well, all the European states, at least, set up systems to welcome the highly skilled, and they get all sorts of entry privileges, privileges in terms of long-term residence and family reunion. It's not just Europe. The United States is competing to attract the highly skilled. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all these countries have set up special systems. It's very general. The fiction remains that the low-skilled are not needed, and I think that's partly because politicians can't sell the truth about the labour market to the public. So it's more and more common for lower-skilled workers to migrate in an irregular way. And what about, how does that match up with what's happening in the South, in less developed regions of Africa, Asia and Latin America? Well, I would argue that the neoliberal shifts in the way the global economy and the global labour market works create a complementarity between North and South. And it's a big subject, but to sum it up very briefly, you have firstly the change in agriculture, the so-called Green Revolution, which is wonderful because it means agriculture produces more food, which is what the world needs. But it has the side effect of reducing employment in agriculture, because the new techniques using new seed stock, fertilizers, irrigation, tractors and so on require less workers. The poorer farmers can't buy the inputs, they have to give up their land and they move into the cities. And when they move into the cities, they find there are very few formal sector jobs. People survive through informal activities. But of course, at the same time, the social conditions, the human rights situation is often very poor in these cities. People lack human security, and there's a very strong motivation to try and get out. So people who have the resources either move internally, and of course internal migration is bigger than international migration, but those who really have enough resources, and not only money resources, but also social contacts and knowledge of migration routes, try and move to the north. And however dangerous, however risky that journey is, many of them believe that the rewards make it worthwhile. Of quite rightly, of course. So there's a complementarity. There's a strong desire to move out of these bad conditions, and at the same time, these new media, the new technologies of communication created by globalization, create the ability to move through cheaper and better transport, and the cultural and social capital, the knowledge of where to go, how to go, the networks that are needed. And then we have finally this idea of the migration industry, which is a new international business worth billions of dollars. And you'll all have heard of people smuggling and trafficking, which is the illegal end of the migration industry, but much more of the migration industry is completely legal. It's banks, labour recruiters, travel agents, lawyers, all these people who facilitate migration and who help people along the way. Some of them former migrants themselves, many of them just business people. So it's one of the fastest growing international businesses. So there are lots of reasons why migration continues, even when governments try and put the brake on it, or at least claim they're trying to put the brake on it. And what comes out of that in the end is a highly flexible global workforce, which has various components. One component, as I've mentioned, is the movement of highly skilled workers from less developed to more developed countries, workers who, of course, embody a great deal of human capital that has been paid for by the origin country. A second element is the outsourcing of innovation, scientific and innovation capacity. For instance, a lot of the basic work on new electronic products is now done in low-wage countries, particularly India, of course, where scientifically trained workers are much less paid than they are in Silicon Valley. So that's another part of the global division of labour. And another part of it, of course, is what we call business process outsourcing. So when you call your bank and you're actually speaking to someone in Manila or Bangalore, that's business process outsourcing. It's just much cheaper for your bank to pay the international call fees than to pay US or European salaries. Another part of the global labour market is what I've put very euphemistically as flexible employment. And these are the new practices that have developed everywhere in the United States, Europe, Australia, and so on. They're new forms of flexible employment relationships, subcontracting. In other words, truck drivers, builders, taxi drivers, people like that, are no longer employees of big companies who buy the equipment and pay a salary. They are independent contractors who bear all the risk of accident, illness, or simply not being able to get work. If you ever have the good luck to fly to New York and you're invited by a big company and you're met by one of these so-called black cars, try talking to the driver and finding out what their conditions are. They've actually had to buy the car. They've had to spend $30,000 or $40,000 on buying a Lincoln town car, and they're paying it off at high interest to the company that they are not employed by. That's the way it works. Another aspect of this is the sort of informal or casual employment. People in catering, retail, care workers are often employed by the hour, by the day, or by the week. They don't have secure jobs. They're very vulnerable. Their employment situation is highly precarious. And of course, this type of work affects young people a great deal. It affects women a great deal. The whole care industry, which is now a global industry that has grown in a way I think no one would have predicted 10 years ago, is based on differentiating women based on gender, ethnicity, race, and of course legal status. Because if people are irregular in their resident status, it's much easier to pay them low wages. And I know quite a few members of the US political class have got caught out by employing irregulars, but it's a very widespread practice. So we have a new system of labour market segmentation based on gender, age, location, in other words, where you live and work, but above all on origins and legal status and on race and ethnicity. And that's really where the global labour market is at the moment, I think. So that was really the first theme, how the global labour market has developed. But the other two components are essential too, and I'll deal with them a little bit more briefly. So this is the second one, what has happened to the welfare state. There was a period, I've dated it from 1945 to the 70s, which is true for Europe. I think in the US the dates would be slightly different. And I'm just following there the categorization of a Swedish scholar called Esping, I can't remember his first name, Esping Andersson, Gunnar, something like that, I can't remember. He breaks it down into these three different types of regime. The Anglo-American regime, based mainly on a sort of residual welfare state where people get benefits if they fall out of the labour process. Then the more conservative Central and Southern European corporate regime, as Esping Andersson puts it. I think he's got it slightly wrong. I'd divide between countries like Italy and countries like Germany. I think they're a bit different. And then the Scandinavian model. And then there's an Australian model which Esping Andersson doesn't deal with, which was based very much on full employment, on wages being set by the government. But we won't talk about that. The point that Esping Andersson makes for that period is that in all those regimes you get an increase in the capacity of the welfare state to protect workers. And that means that workers cannot be forced into doing very poorly paid jobs under very poor conditions because they can fall back on welfare state payments. And he calls it a decommodification of labour. It means people have choices. They don't have to accept any sort of wages and conditions. I've put there rather unkindly, even in the United States, in this period from the New Deal to the Great Society, there is a development of a welfare state, quite a significant welfare state in the US. Now, the second phase of that is a phase of recommodification. And this is really what I mean by the Neoliberal Counter-Revolution. Because following the oil crisis in the 70s, going through the late 70s, the early 80s, you get the neoliberal theoretical doctrine being developed by people like Milton Friedman, and then inspiring a new generation of politicians to try and create a new economic system with a far weaker role for the welfare state. And I'm thinking there obviously of politicians like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and their equivalents in other places. And the idea is that welfare ceases to be a right. People have to work for the dole through what are called workfare regimes, and there's a differentiation between the so-called deserving and the undeserving poor. People who deserve some compassion and help because they're physically disabled or sick or whatever, or of course people who've reached retirement age, and then people who don't deserve it. It's their own fault. And as there's a very well-known US scholar of the welfare state called Alazina, I'm sure the name's familiar to you, I can't remember his first name. Alazina argues that in the United States this is very closely connected also with issues of race, that people see the undeserving poor as being people of a different race who they don't want to support. Alazina argues that also applies to Europe. That's not so clear, but we can talk about that later. So the idea is to racialize poverty, to try and blame the poor because they are somehow inferior, and they're categorized as being inferior on racial or ethnic grounds. And that legitimates the reduction of welfare systems as a general right. So you get a recommodification and an uncoupling of the right to a basic support, or a recoupling, really, of the right to a basic support to actually being in the labour market. And that means people have to take lousy jobs. That's what it's all about. So that's the second element of what's happened. And the third element is what I call the globalization of the nation state. Now, adherents of postmodern theory have argued for a long time that the nation state is getting less and less important. And I disagree with that for a number of reasons. One reason is that there are more and more nation states. We've moved from 50 nation states who founded the United Nations to 192 today. Of course, that's partly because of or mostly because of decolonization, and then because of the breakup of the Soviet Union. But it's hard to argue that the nation state is getting less important. Where the nation state is losing power is with regard to control of its boundaries. It's very hard for the nation states to protect welfare systems if that raises the social wage to the point where industry becomes non-competitive. It's very hard for the state to maintain its control of the economy, welfare, and so on. And what's happened at the same time is that there are more and more flows of people across frontiers, and that too is seen as a problem because it's seen as a threat to identity, to social cohesion, I think is the term that's used a lot. We see politicians, particularly at the moment, trying to reassert that control. Whether it will be possible is another question, because virtually every developed state has become far more diverse in its identity and its ethnic composition in the last 30 or 40 years. But all the same, what states try and do is to build up a system of hierarchies so that everybody has become a citizen. And this is really new in human history. This is the first time in the history of the world that most people are citizens. But citizenship means something very different in different countries. And I think, although all citizens are meant to be equal, the reality is that there's a strong hierarchy, just like there's a hierarchy of nation states. And it's something like that. If you've got a US passport, you've got a very high level of human rights protection and other rights, and so have citizens of other Western states. But as you go down the order, you'll find people have less and less rights. And of course, the worst thing to be in a world of nation states is stateless, or this term of Australian law, an unlawful person. That's really bad, to be an unlawful person. So everybody has a passport, but a lot of those passports would not get you across the US border, not very easily anyway. There's a real hierarchy of what it means to be a citizen. And that hierarchy is enforced in interesting ways. I thought you might like to see this. This is a picture of the... this is a European picture, actually. It's the Spanish enclave of Melilla, which is completely surrounded by Morocco. And African migrants who want to get into Europe sometimes try and cross this border. You can see it's not an easy border to cross. The night before that picture was taken, there'd been a mass attempt to scale the walls, and the Moroccan police had opened fire and killed, I think, 6 or 8 African migrants. These are Spanish border guards who came out in force the next day just to show they really were in control. That is not unique to Europe, of course, and you'll be very familiar with this picture too, I think. This is the wall that was built by the Clinton administration under Operation Gateway, and this is a beach between Tijuana and San Diego. I see this as a sort of medieval solution to 21st century problems. I mean, as if you could solve the world's problems of inequality and conflict by building walls. But politicians do believe this, and I believe there are about 50 different walls in the world today, designed either to keep people out or to keep people in, or sometimes both. And if you look on the web, you'll find pictures of many of these walls in quite surprising places. So the result of that is that we have these hierarchies of citizens. If you're a citizen of a developed country and you're a national, in other words, you belong to the dominant ethnic group, you're not a Roma or a member of some other ethnic minority in the European case, and you've got a job, you're in the formal economy, then you're pretty well off. A little worse off are people who are citizens but who can't get a decent job, sometimes called the working poor. And then, of course, if you're a member of the undeserving poor, the ethnic minorities that are seen as not really legitimately there, then you're in real trouble. The next stage of citizenship is what a Swedish colleague once called denizens. And these are migrants who are legal and have built up a body of rights. So in many countries in Europe, especially, say, Sweden or Germany, if you live for a certain number of years, you don't commit any offence, you always register with the police. After some years, you get all sorts of rights. And in fact, it becomes very hard to deport you. Not impossible, but difficult. And then you have all these marginal groups who are really in a much more difficult situation. I just go through a few of the problems and then I'll talk a little bit about the recession and then we'll have some time for questions. One of the challenges to this global labour market system that's developed is this sort of demographic change that's taking place. Let me just go forward a little bit. There's a belief on the part of politicians in developed countries that there will always be supplies of workers to fill the demographic and economic gaps. Well, if you look at this, you can see, this is Europe, obviously. This is total fertility rate. Are you familiar with the concept? Total fertility rate is the number of children that the average woman has in her lifetime. And obviously, to reproduce the population, the average woman must have at least 2 children. Slightly more, actually. And Europe is well below the reproduction rate. North America is falling below the reproduction rate. But these parts of the world still have, the blue column is for, that's going back to 1975. This is the current situation. And this is the situation going up to 2050. And you can see that in just 20 or 30 years, there will be very few demographic reserves left in the world. So it will become harder and harder to sustain this current system of labour migration as it is at the moment. That's the first issue. The second issue, of course, is the new social movements, that there are new movements developing which protest against this type of unequal development, unequal conditions for different workers. And I'll just give you a few examples. This is an interesting one. Now, that's a picture that may be familiar to you. This is sort of the literally pinnacle of postmodernity, the tallest building in the world, the Burj Dubai, which was opened at the beginning of this year. It's 828 meters high, or 2,700 feet to you. So this marvelous construction, isn't it? But who built it? That's the question. Was it the chief architect, an American called Adrian Smith, or the chief structural engineer, a British man called Bill Baker? No, it was these guys. This is the labour force, or a very small portion of the labour force, that built the Burj Dubai. These are South Asian workers, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, who were employed to build this wonderful tower. And it sort of shows the contrast between modernity and the way modernity is constructed. They actually went on strike in March 2006, which was totally illegal, of course, in Dubai. Workers were not allowed to strike. But their conditions were so appalling that they did it anyway. They were actually striking not for better wages and conditions, but to get their wages paid because they hadn't been paid for months. And the government of Dubai actually took action and did introduce some labour protection legislation because they were so shocked by something like this that could tarnish their image. But these workers live in the most appalling encampments. I should really have some pictures of those. But that shows the sort of contradiction in the contemporary model of labour mobilisation. This is another interesting one. These are young women of North African origin demonstrating in France in 2007. And the day before, or a couple of days before this picture was taken, two young men, and they're carrying a picture of one of them, had been killed. They were running away from the police and they went into an electricity power station and got electrocuted. And these young women were demonstrating for justice, for better rights for the minority in France. And the reason why this picture is interesting, of course, is that the French left supports the ban on the Islamic headscarf. They would find it very hard to talk to these women because they don't support the way that they wear religious symbols. So, it's a real challenge for the left to respond to that sort of thing. And this one, of course, you've all seen before. On the website it said Los Angeles, but I think that might even be Chicago. Yeah?
No, it's a blue street sign,
It's
it's not Chicago.
not Chicago. Okay, so it is Los Angeles. This is one of the huge demonstrations of March to May 2006, when there were demonstrations simultaneously in over 100 US cities. And of course, well, you know this better than me, these were not demonstrations. They were demonstrations for inclusion. You can see all the US flags. They were demonstrations not to be deported, not to be criminalized. They were demonstrations for the recognition that these people, many of whom are strictly speaking illegal, are actually a crucial part of the US labour market. And I think that's one of the reasons this system is rather unsustainable. In the end, it's based on people, and people develop their agency and will not forever accept such conditions. Okay, final segment is just what happened in the global economic crisis with regard to labour migration. I've been trying to collect information to find out what really happened, because it was predicted that the crisis would lead to a great reduction in labour migration, strong return migration, strong falls in remittances, the money that people send home. Did that actually happen? We're now in a position to begin to answer those questions. Just to give you the commercial, we've been collecting articles on this topic on the website for the Age of Migration. So if you want to get more authoritative detail on all this, have a look at the website, and there are a lot of articles you can get, not by me, but by a lot of other people. What we've found is that labour migration has declined, but not a great deal if you take a global average. There are even countries where it's increased, like the Philippines, but there are other countries where it has declined, like the United States and Mexico. What has declined a lot is irregular migration, which shows that irregular migrants are particularly sensitive to labour market conditions because they've got nothing to fall back on if they haven't got jobs. There has been no fall, as far as I can make out, in non-economic migration, and most migration is non-economic. I mean, that's often forgotten. For instance, family reunion has barely been affected, or not been affected, as far as I can make out. The largest single category in the United States is still family reunion, as it is in most countries. There has been no decline in marriage migration, very important in East Asia. 15% of marriages in Korea now are between Korean men and foreign women, 25% in Taiwan. That hasn't declined. Educational migration has declined because people haven't got the resources to send their kids to other countries to study. And of course, forced migration hasn't declined because the refugee situation obviously has not got better because of the crisis. So the expectations are not completely correct. What we have seen is a lot of hostility to migrants in many countries and a reduced recruitment in some countries. So that's the short-term analysis. The long-term is that things may be even worse in regions of origin, so people may actually have more reason to migrate than before. And what we've also found is that a lot of migrants stay in destination countries, even if they lose their jobs, even if they have reduced earnings, because they have obligations to send remittances home. And in many cases, they cut their own expenditure and live under bad conditions in order to go on sending money home. Remittances, surprisingly, fell only by 6% at the depth of the crisis, according to the World Bank, and are now growing again. There is a change, though, because up to 2007, there were very rapid growth rates in remittances. So there was a dip, and now it's beginning to grow again, but at a slower rate. But what about the very long term, which in a way is what interests me most? And if you look at the experience of previous major economic crises, you see that they have different types of effects on migration. So the crisis of the 1930s led to a sharp decline in migration and to a lot of return migration, some of it forced. And you probably know that in the United States, many Mexicans were actually forced to leave the country, as were many Poles and Italians in France, for instance. But a lot did stay on and became permanent residents. The oil crisis of 1973, I've already talked about it, led to a complete revamping of global migration systems. It led to a process of settlement which had not been expected in Western Europe. It led to the emergence of new migration systems in the global south, in East Asia and in Africa and so on. So that led to a major change. And then if you look at the Asian financial crisis of 1997, 99, very little effect on migration. There was a dip. Migrants were sent home from countries like Malaysia and Korea, but it was very temporary, and migration grew again quickly. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what type of crisis are we experiencing at the moment? Is it a major structural crisis, or is it just a dip in the economy, a periodic conjunctural crisis? My own belief is that it is a major structural crisis, that it's going to lead to some important changes. One of them is the possible decline of the powers that have been dominant, economically dominant up to now, like the United States, like Western Europe, and the rise of new economic powers like, well, I've put the BRICS countries, Brazil. You can see the enormous development taking place. Russia, I'm not so sure about, but India and China and South Africa, certainly a great deal of development. So a possible restructuring of global migration systems over the next 10 years, is that a good thing for worker rights? Well, anybody's question, probably not, because worker rights in some of these emerging migration countries are probably even less respected than in existing immigration countries. So not necessarily a good thing. So to come to a conclusion, is it the end of the neoliberal dream or not? Well, It's a dualistic dream. It's the idea of cosmopolitanism, the idea that elites can and should be mobile, and elites indeed are very mobile, but a world of barriers, exploitation and restrictions for everybody else. And is that system going to simply be reborn in the years ahead, always assuming the crisis is finished, which we don't quite know at the moment? I think there are opportunities for change at the moment. We could have more inclusive forms of globalization. We could see better protection of the environment, which I haven't talked about, but is clearly a major issue. And we could have new forms of global cooperation based on legality, equality, and inclusion for migrants and indeed for other workers. Will that happen? Well, not by itself. And I think, the only forces that could bring about that change are firstly the fact that developed countries begin to realize that the demographic benefits they get from migration will not go on forever unless they form much better partnerships with origin countries. And secondly, if new social movements and civil society movements really become powerful enough to insist on a system where there is equality of rights and people can migrate legally and with dignity and safety. I don't know if we'll get to that point, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, first of all, for that amazing and rich substantive tour of the whole field. I guess there are 2 or 3 questions that can come up. The first, it seems to me that the world is becoming both more global but more local at the same time. And those processes seem to reinforce each other. And I wonder about the claim that there's been a growth of multi-ethnic populations. Because I would have thought exactly the opposite was happening. That if you looked around the end of the 19th century to the turn of the 20th century, you would have found many more political entities in which there was no dominant ethnic group. And that the 20th century, including the recent period, has been one in which ethno-nationalist projects have succeeded in breaking up formally multi-ethnic entities like the Soviet Union, like Yugoslavia. We can go on and on and on. With the impulse to create new states that do have dominant ethnic majority. And in a sense, that process is as powerful as the globalization process. So as far as I can tell, there are only 2 countries in Europe that could really claim to be multi-ethnic. One being Belgium, which is about to split up or possibly may split up on ethnic grounds, and the other Switzerland, in which they've locked in a kind of multi-ethnicity in all sorts of legal ways. But I hardly think we could argue, one could argue that the world's becoming more and more multi-ethnic. And indeed, it seems to me what we're seeing is a defensive reaction against any threat to the ethno-nationalist project in many states throughout Europe. Which makes me wonder about your characterization of the neoliberal dream. Because it seems to me the dream comes closer to what you were suggesting, which is some kind of world of cosmopolitan citizenship in which everyone is free and equal and can flow across boundaries, and there is no, you call it security control, but basically in-group, out-group differentiation in which you want to maintain your in-group. And your in-group is based on trust, commonality, common history, common religion, common language. So, I'd like to hear more about your notion of the multi-ethnic increase, as I don't see it.
Yeah, well, that's clearly a question of how you look at it, because obviously the multi-ethnic empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire for that matter, many of these empires have broken up. But it's obvious that those empires, like the Ottoman Empire, are based on the dominance of one particular group. They are not in any way empires based on equality. And what we had in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century is this whole issue of building nation states. In other words, the principle that the population of a given territory has a certain cultural commonality, which makes it a nation. And that's a process that really went through, I mean, it starts a bit earlier, but it really reaches its peak after the First World War and in the run-up to the Second World War. When I say multi-ethnicity, what I mean is that every developed country, and many less developed countries, I should add, now have issues around the fact that they have large and highly visible minorities. The average level of immigrant minorities in European countries is about 10% of the population at the moment. It's higher in some countries. For instance, Sweden, it's pretty close to 20%. Often many of these people are citizens, but they're seen as ethnically different. They're often segregated both at work and residentially. The level is higher in the United States. I think it's about 12%. In Australia, it's the highest of all, it's 23%. And of course, the governments of these countries have been looking for ways to manage it, because the fiction of the nation state is this identity between people and territory and culture. And it's a fiction that can't be sustained. It can't be sustained when you have, an average level of population where you have a minority of between 10 and 15%, and where the cities, which are often very determining in nations, where the cities have much higher volumes. For instance, the highest of all is Toronto, where 44% of the population are immigrants. In London, it's about 25. In Sydney, it's about 32. The United States, of course, you have the situation that the old WASP majority is being eroded, and you have very large African American and Hispanic minorities. So, I mean, most developed states are facing up to an issue of cultural change and fears of fragmentation. And I must add, it's because I've worked a lot in Asia. It really isn't just the old Western nations. Countries like Malaysia and Korea, indeed, today have big issues around ethnicity. So, yeah, I think there's a really important process of change taking place, and it isn't captured by, I don't think it's captured by what you're saying. I think the multi-ethnic empires are a very different form of managing difference than today's nation states. But your last remark, I mean, I think it's really important. The image of cosmopolitanism, and it's been very big in the social sciences, particularly sociology. You read what people like Ulrich Beck say about cosmopolitanism. For me, it's incredibly idealistic, this idea of people with cosmopolitan consciousness who have the right to live everywhere and move around all the time. It's an elite model. It applies to a very small proportion of the world's population, and it doesn't apply to the majority who are excluded and controlled.
And talking about it in my own sense, that human rights creates very complicated sets of relationships when they are brought to bear on asylum regimes and labor migration regimes. And maybe to ask you to speak about it in relation to the concept of class. So, for example, in Ireland, politicians have been unable to prevent the disbursement of great, significant sums of money from the EU for the promotion of human rights, but only in relation to the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, and not in relation to an increasingly disenfranchised Indigenous Irish population. we all know has then knock-on effects. So maybe if you could speak to the fact that there are oftentimes backlashes as a result of these complicated interventions on the part of the manufacturers.
I mean, I have to say that I personally am also very skeptical about human rights in the sense that by appealing to human rights, one appeals to states to do the right thing. And states don't do it unless they're put under a lot of pressure. And the biggest example of that in the migration field is the 1990 UN Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, which is the UN human rights instrument for the protection of migrant workers. And it took, 12 years to come into force, 13 years? I think 20% of the world's nations or the UN's members have to sign something or ratify it before it comes into force. This took 13 years to come into force. It's been ratified by 42 nations. Is that right?
And there's an interesting statistic. The UNDP, in their report they did last year on human mobility, their big annual report, ranks countries by the Human Development Index and then tracks which treaties they've ratified. And none of the top 42 countries in the Human Development Index have ratified the Migratory Workers Convention. You have to get down to Chile, is number 43, and they've ratified it. And then you have to get down to about number 80 before you begin to get the majority of the countries have ratified. So it's all sending countries.
So it's not the labour importing countries. They've refused to ratify an instrument to support the rights of migrant workers. Now, what I mean by human rights is something slightly different, and this is what we're trying to do with this People's Global Action meeting, and that is to say, if a nation imports labour, it's a very bad idea to do it in an illegal way. And the United States is the worst example, I have to tell you. With over 11 million irregular residents. If a nation wants to base its labour system or its production system on importing labour, then it should create the means to do that legally. In other words, all people who migrate should do that under conditions of legality, safety, protection, and so on. I think that's a very powerful demand. And I think, the groups who are organised in this civil society meeting that's about to take place see that as a form of leverage, because at the moment there's a very powerful discourse on migration and development. It's the idea that poor nations can develop by sending millions of their people abroad to work in other economies, and that will lead to development through remittances. And these organizations are very skeptical on that. And they say, well, if people do migrate, they shouldn't do it under conditions of, in many cases, appalling danger and exploitation. And I think if you put the human rights demand like that, it's a powerful instrument. But it won't, I don't think that, developed countries will change their policies because someone makes a good demand. I think they'll do it when they begin to find it very hard to manage their labour markets without doing it in a legal way. In the long run, it seems entirely contradictory that developed states based on the rule of law should base their labour policies on illegality. So I think there is leverage there.
But I think what I'm trying to suggest is that we're actually seeing a backlash against human rights policies because disenfranchised indigenous groups will no longer support them. You hear people like Tony Blair talking about withdrawing from the Geneva Convention. You hear many people, the Germans now saying that multiculturalism is a failed experiment. If you walk in and through Ireland, you will see many, many people who sought to import labor in a sort of illegal sense. It's dealing with a very high asylum and refugee population, and that sort of, changes the sort of perspective and prism through which you have to look at the application of human rights.
Yeah.
On the state, I'm speaking about, so the state's obligation to adhere to human rights constraints.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, there is a trend in world politics at the moment away from these things. I agree entirely. But we're not exactly suggesting that governments like the US government should embrace human rights. We're just saying that they should embrace the rule of law, that they should work out what workers are needed for which industries at any one time and make sure that migration can take place in a legal way. And I think that's a strong demand. It's actually not as such a human rights demand, though it leads to human rights. It's a demand for recognizing basic principles of legality. So I don't know. You're probably right, though, unfortunately, but it's worth trying. Yeah.
My name is Rebecca Warner. I'm a student in the college. I was interested by your mention of new social movements, because there's a lot of literature coming out on it right now from Brazil, India, South Africa, places like that. And particularly that one of your examples came from the US, where, at least, and perhaps this is like a very pejorative view, that it seems as though protest and methods of resistance in the US is in somewhat of a state of crisis, that those huge protests that we saw on immigration in 2006 didn't do anything to prevent Arizona from passing their incredibly conservative law. And there were more protests after that, which after one 24-hour news cycle were suddenly out of the picture. So, I was hoping that maybe you could speak through your work to methodologies and ideas in these new social movements, which have actually been effective both in the global north and the global south.
The problem is how you measure effectiveness, of course. I mean, what you can see at the moment, what I showed in these pictures were not, as Ellie always tells me, social movements. They're protest movements. Social movements require a certain level of organization. And, there are certainly migrant social movements developing, they're strictly speaking, they're movements of migrants or associations of migrants working together with associations of other population groups that are seeking to protect rights of migrants or human rights in general. And there are also links with the environmental movement. I mean, I can see these movements developing in a way I haven't been able to see it in the past. But it's very hard to make any sort of objective measure of that. And as for success, I think we haven't reached that point where you could say that these movements have had a successful input. I mean, what you can say at the moment is, you actually have to go back a bit. If you go back to 1994, to the World Population Congress of the United Nations, which took place in Cairo, the origin countries of migrant workers did call for a political process of the United Nations to improve migrants' rights. And there was no action whatsoever taken on that. It was simply ignored, except that in 1998, the United Nations held what was called a technical symposium, which was an expert meeting, and it wasn't a political meeting in any way, and it was really meant to brush this whole issue under the carpet, say, we're doing something when in fact the UN wasn't. Then in 2003, Kofi Annan did call for the formation of a global commission on migration and development, which met and produced a very good report in 2005. And the upshot of that was that the UN held its first ever political meeting. They called it the high-level dialogue, which meant it was at the level of ministers or senior officials in 2006. And what came out of that was this Global Forum on Migration and Development, which has met every year and, as far as I can see, achieved nothing. That might be a harsh verdict, but it's hard to see tangible results.
Well, the countries who were supposed to be the hosts the next 2 years have now abandoned the project.
Yeah. But I think what is really encouraging is that this one that's taking place in Mexico in 10 days' time is for the first time having a serious dialogue with civil society organizations, migrant organizations on the whole. And I think that is a step forward, but it's a slow process. And, if you can see, it's gone back 16 years already, and we have this tiny progress. I don't know. I mean, is it worth it? It's very hard to say at the moment. I think it's worth trying, but whether it will lead anywhere, we'll see in a year or two. These are not good times for that sort of thing.
Steve, I have a couple of questions on the floor.
Yeah.
You speak about, I'm no worker, I teach sociology. You speak about kind of nationalistic fiction of a cultural homogeneity. You also talk about a hierarchy of citizenship. What I'm wondering is if this concept of citizenship is increasingly a fiction, that what is at play is simply a kind of social class division of elites and non-elites. Whether the idea of citizenship can actually be strengthened by people like the Tea Party and the anti-immigration forces, or whether this is a kind of meaningless posturing in the face of economic developments. Whether citizenship is itself an increasing fiction.
Well, that's a hugely difficult question, obviously, but I think, what you have to look at is what the nation state still does and what it stopped doing. And the nation state can no longer protect certain areas like welfare states. It's very hard. I mean, if you look at Germany, which tried to protect its welfare state and found it was losing out in international competition and is now having to reduce it very significantly to survive economically. So you see, even very powerful states have problems protecting that sort of social citizenship. At the same time, political citizenship gets less meaningful if the nation state is no longer capable of making the decisions to protect its citizens. So there's an erosion, but it's not a complete erosion. I think we're moving towards a sort of multi-level governance world where decisions are made at different levels. Now, the problem is that the only levels where we really still have democracy of a sort is where elections are held. In other words, the national level and to some extent subnational levels of state and city governments. But some of the biggest decisions that affect our lives are completely beyond the realm of citizen control. Look at the international financial institutions. There is very little control or even understanding of what they do. But even more than that, the hugely powerful international corporations are in no way subject to citizen control. And if any nation state tries to control a particular corporation, it will simply move its operations or its headquarters elsewhere. So we have the problem that citizenship is losing meaning, and the meaning it tends to have is, as you say, the defensive meaning of extreme nationalism and exclusion, the Tea Party type citizen.
It doesn't help. Flagship state universities get only about 10% of their students from the bottom half of the income distribution. At a place like the University of Chicago, your chances of getting in the University of Chicago are much better if you're the child of a Hong Kong millionaire than if you're a poor person from 3 blocks away from here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does citizenship mean?
I don't fully understand the significance of your example, but it's quite clear that the nation state can't protect its citizens in the way it could maybe 50 years ago. Sometimes it's not desirable that it should. it's not desirable that national privileges should be preserved. And I think if you look at the politics of extreme right-wing groups, take Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, or this new racist party that won 20 seats in Sweden recently, or, I mean, I don't know enough about the Tea Party organization to comment on that, I guess, but these types of nationalism don't protect people from outsourcing of jobs, from unemployment, from major shifts in economic systems. They're a spurious form of protection. They're a belief that the nation state can change these things. Look at the example of border control. I mean, the US has spent millions, billions on strengthening its borders to the south. The result of that has not been less migration. It's been firstly to create a small business opportunity. This was what the Clinton government did. It created a small business opportunity for the coyotes, who could then charge anything up to $3,000 for bringing people over. In the meantime, that small business opportunity has been gone, and the big corporation, namely the drug cartels, have taken it over. So the building the wall and the virtual wall and the Boeing project and all those things have simply benefited the drug cartels, if anyone. I mean, it's just not a viable thing anymore. And I think that's the real lesson of globalization, that unless you have international cooperation and you have some form of democratic process, it will all get hollowed out. That's what I think. Yeah.
My name is Dennis Stone. I work as a management consultant, and I'm also a student at Chicago Theological Seminary. I'd like to make a few observations about the U.S. context and invite your response. I understand that in the next 15 years, about 70 million baby boomers will be retiring and leaving the labor market. That is, if we have retirement savings still. And demographically and in terms of immigration current patterns, about 60 million people will replace those retired workers, leaving a gap of 10 million. I expect that American business interests will soon be advocating for more lenient immigration policies, and that would be the hard reform of the Republican Party, the major business interests. So I'm wondering if you see that kind of policy shift in America, and I'm guessing that our example is not even as extreme as France, Germany, Russia, and Japan, that might be more extreme in those countries.
Yeah. Well, I agree very much with those observations, and I mean, on the whole, big businesses are in favor of legal migration because they can handle it. It's marginal businesses that tend, or smaller businesses that like illegal migration. I think that two things will have to be decided by the US government and the French and all the other governments in the years ahead. The first thing is, do they want to maintain certain industries? Is it worth keeping certain industries in high-wage countries, or is it better to offshore them? And I think the one that is most obvious, at least in the European case, and I really don't know the US well enough, but in the European case, it's agriculture. I mean, it's absurd that a country like Britain is producing sugar. Can you imagine? We're producing sugar in completely wrong climatic conditions. And we only do it because there are huge subsidies from the European Union to produce sugar. And it goes to very, very rich landowners, a lot of the old nobility who own 10,000 acres in Norfolk are raking in the EU subsidies. But anyway, I shouldn't go off on a tangent. But so that's the one issue. Do we want to maintain labour-intensive industries in high-wage economies? Or to put it the way Salinas, was he the foreign minister or the president? President, yeah. Said, Americans have to decide whether you want Mexicans to produce tomatoes in California or tomatoes in Mexico. It's still a truth statement, even though it was made some years ago. So that's the first issue. The second issue, of course, is that not all industries can be outsourced. And the one that most obviously, well, the two that most obviously can't be, one is construction. And if older Americans have accumulated savings and want a decent house and someone to look after it, you're going to need construction workers. And care, elder care, health care. You know, you can't offshore that. It's got to be where the people are. There is a trend for British people to move in retirement to Spain and Turkey and countries like that, and for Japanese people to move to the Philippines. I think Americans moved to Mexico, but there's a real limit to that process. I don't think it's ever going to be very big. So, you know, yeah, I think in the long run there has to be a more rational policy. That's the optimistic thing, to say time is on our side, but yeah, how long?
Or I'm not optimistic.